The upper rooms of Bath were lit that evening with the particular extravagance of a season that had, by general consensus, decided it had something to prove. 300 candles burned in the chandeliers, and beneath them, 200 people arranged themselves in the precise configurations that the season demanded. Cecily Vane stood near the far wall, beside a potted bay laurel that no one had trimmed in recent memory, wearing a gown of pale gray-green muslin that she had altered herself over the course of 3 consecutive evenings in the back parlor of her rented lodgings in Pulteney Street. The gown was clean and well pressed. It was not quite fashionable. She had learned, in the 3 years since her husband had left her, that not quite fashionable was the upper register she could manage, and she managed it without self-pity, because self-pity cost energy she needed for other purposes. She was watching the door when Sir Edmund Vane entered. He came through the upper assembly doorway at 8:30. And he came, as she had been told he would, but had not quite believed, with Miss Dorinda Hartley on his arm. She wore white. Edmund wore his dark coat, with the brass buttons she had watched a footman polish every Thursday morning for the 4 years they had shared a household, and he wore it with the same unconscious authority she remembered, as though authority were a garment he had been born inside rather than one he cultivated. The room noticed him. The room noticed Miss Hartley. The room, in the way of rooms, performed a quick, involuntary inventory of the situation, landed on Cecily standing beside the untrimmed laurel, and then deliberately looked elsewhere. She had anticipated this. She had stood in her back parlor in Pulteney Street and rehearsed it until rehearsal gave her something she could rely on. She kept her chin level. She kept her hands loose at her sides, not gripping each other, not seeking a fan to manage. Her breath came in and went out at the same pace it always did. Then Lady Evelyn Vane appeared through the inner door, and the room's second inventory took rather longer. Edmund's mother was 71 and had the erect carriage of a woman who had never once in her adult life permitted herself to be walked past without acknowledgement. She was dressed in dark bronze silk and carried a fan painted with hunting scenes, and she moved through the assembly with the calm certainty of a woman who had stage-managed a great many evenings. Her eyes found Cecily within 6 seconds of entering the room. She did not speak. She simply looked, with the level composure of someone confirming that a piece of furniture was still in its expected position, and then she looked away. Cecily had anticipated this too. She had not anticipated how it would feel to be inventoried and dismissed by a pair of gray eyes in a ballroom full of witnesses, to feel the calculation behind the glance, to understand in her marrow that she was being observed not with contempt, but with something considerably colder than contempt. The dispassionate satisfaction of a plan proceeding as designed. She was still standing beside the bay laurel, still breathing at the same measured pace, when she became aware of a stillness at her right, perhaps 3 feet from her position. Not an approach, precisely. More an arrival that had completed itself without her noticing it had begun. She turned her head. The man standing near her was not anyone she recognized from the 3 seasons she had attended as Edmund's wife. He was tall, with dark brown hair worn short and without powder, and gray eyes directed at the far end of the room with the particular quality of attention that looks like idleness and is its precise opposite. His dark coat was well cut and understated, and there was a line between his brows that belonged to concentration rather than displeasure. And he was, she decided in the brief moment she had before, it would become observable that she was looking at him. The most self-contained person she had encountered in the assembly rooms since her husband had abandoned them to her exclusive occupation. He did not look at her. He did not look at Sir Edmund either. though the room's current had shifted unmistakably in Edmund's direction. He looked at the far end of the room with gray eyes that noted everything, and returned nothing. And Cecily looked back at the untrimmed laurel, and reminded herself that the evening had several hours remaining, and that she had, at this point in her life, considerably more practice at endurance than at anything else. She had been practicing since the morning in April, 3 years past, when Edmund had come to her sitting room with the expression she had learned to dread, the expression of a man about to deliver a verdict he has rehearsed until it sounds reasonable, and told her that the marriage could not continue, that she had failed to provide what a marriage of their kind required, that his mother and his solicitors were in agreement that a formal separation was the only course remaining. He had not used the word barren. He had used the phrase naturally deficient in the most essential capacity, which she had understood to mean the same thing, and which had arrived in her body like cold water poured slowly down her spine. She had sat very still and listened to the entire speech, and when he had finished, she had asked, in a voice she did not recognize as her own, whether the household accounts would remain in her charge during the period of separation. He had blinked at her, clearly having anticipated some other response, and said that the solicitors would take charge of the accounts. That was when she had understood that something was very wrong with the accounts. Edmund left on the 6th of May. By the first week of June, Cecily had managed, through methods that required patience and the cooperation of Mrs. Agnes Fowler, who had kept the Vane household's kitchen books for 11 years, and who loved Cecily with the quiet ferocity of a woman whose loyalty, once given, was not recoverable, to obtain copies of 4 years of household expenditure. She had spread them on the table in the back parlor of the lodgings his solicitors had found acceptable, and she had sat down with a candle and an adding rod, and she had begun to read. She was by nature precise. Her father, the Reverend Thomas Harwood of Dorset, had taught her double-entry bookkeeping, as other fathers taught their daughters pianoforte, on the grounds that if a woman was going to manage a household, she might as well manage it correctly. She had entered the Vane marriage with that gift, and had applied it diligently for 4 years, maintaining records that any competent person could follow. What she discovered in the copies Agnes had preserved was that someone else had also been maintaining records, and that those records and hers did not agree, and that the nature of their disagreement was systematic rather than accidental, and that the sum involved, across 4 years of carefully altered ledger entries, was £14,317. She had sat with that number for the better part of a night. She had written it in the center of a clean sheet of paper and looked at it until it ceased to surprise her. Then she had begun to build the comparison columns, her entries against the altered entries, entry by entry, quarter by quarter, with the precision that her father had given her and that the marriage had, unexpectedly, kept alive. She was still building those columns in the small, quiet hours of Bath evenings, when the season brought Edmund back to the upper rooms with Miss Hartley on his arm, and Lady Evelyn with her fan of hunting scenes, and Cecily stood beside the untrimmed bay laurel and held her chin level and breathed at the pace she had trained herself to breathe at, and did not look again at the tall man with the gray eyes who had come to stand near her with the quality of someone who had decided to be somewhere and had no intention of explaining why. She saw him again 3 mornings later at the pump room. Bath in the morning had a different register than Bath in the evening. The chandeliers were dark, the assembly machinery was stilled, and the pump room settled into the quieter commerce of people who had come for their health, or to pretend they had, and who occupied the gilt chairs around the perimeter with varying degrees of genuine infirmity. Cecily came every Tuesday and Thursday because her rented lodgings were cold in the mornings, and the pump room was warm, and because she had, since establishing herself in Bath, made a practice of being visible in places where respectable women were visible, on the grounds that invisibility was the condition Edmund and his mother had designed for her, and she declined to cooperate with it more than circumstance required. She had brought her notebook, separate from the ledger, a calfskin-covered thing in which she worked calculations in a private shorthand she had developed over the 3 years of the separation. She was not working the Vane accounts in the pump room, those she handled only at home, with the door latched. She was working a different problem, the calculation of what she could demonstrate to a solicitor, in what order, in what forum, that would produce an outcome the social machinery of Bath could not dismiss as a discarded wife's bitterness. She did not hear him approach because the pump room had a particular level of ambient sound, the shuffle of feet on stone and the low conversation of 40 people who had nothing urgent to discuss. "You are calculating something," said a voice to her left, "that requires more concentration than the newspaper merits." She looked up. The man from the upper rooms was sitting 2 chairs away, in the chair that had been unoccupied when she last surveyed the room, and he was watching her with the steady gray eyes that noted everything, and he had a newspaper open in his hands that he was clearly not reading. "I beg your pardon?" she said. "The newspaper." He indicated the periodical on the table between them, which had been abandoned by a previous occupant. "You have been looking at it for 10 minutes without turning a page. I concluded the object of your attention was the notebook." It was not an impertinence, precisely. It was the sort of observation that is only impertinent if the observer is wrong, and he was not wrong. She considered him for a moment. His face in morning light was more readable than it had been by candlelight. The line between his brows, the steady quality of his attention, the fact that he was not performing the pump room, not arranging himself for the benefit of the room, but simply present in it in the way of someone for whom presence required no arrangement. "I am working a balance," she said, "in a calfskin notebook at the pump room. I find the noise helpful for concentration. It prevents complete silence, which I find excessive." There was a brief pause, and then something happened in the vicinity of his mouth that was not a smile, but was perhaps the distant relation of one. "Richard Calder," he said. "Viscount Aldermere." "Cecily Vane," she said. And then, with the small precision that cost her nothing to deploy, but that she deployed anyway, the way she deployed all precise things. "Nay, Harwood," she said. His gray eyes stayed level. He did not perform the inventory she was accustomed to, the quick social calculation that registered her married name, located the separation, adjusted accordingly. He simply received the information and held it, which was not a thing she had encountered often enough to have a name for. "Mrs. Vane," he said. "Miss Vane, if you please," she said. "I have been using my father's name for some time now. The other one sits poorly." He looked at her for a moment in the particular way she was already beginning to recognize, the way of someone who has heard a thing that connects to something he has not spoken aloud and is deciding whether to speak it now or to carry it further in silence. He said, "I understand the sentiment." He turned back to his newspaper. He turned a page this time and read it with the appearance of genuine attention. And she turned back to her notebook, and they sat in companionable proximity for the better part of an hour. And when she left, she was aware, without looking, that his eyes had lifted from the newspaper. The morning after that, Mrs. Agnes Fowler arrived from Dorset with the original ledgers. Agnes was 63, and built like someone who had spent 6 decades not being moved by things that were designed to move her. Broad-shouldered and direct-eyed, and carrying a canvas bag that clinked when she set it on the parlor table. Inside the bag were 6 years of household account books in Cecily's hand, preserved because Agnes had argued that what belonged to the household belonged to its mistress, and had carried them away in her own portmanteau when the solicitors came to collect the papers. The solicitors had apparently not noticed, or had decided the kitchen accounts were beneath their attention. Cecily thought the latter more likely. She spread the 6 volumes on the table and began the process of formal comparison, her figures against the altered figures she had reconstructed from the copies, and she worked through that morning and the morning after and the morning after that, building the document that Mr. Brent would eventually call, in front of 200 people, the clearest private accounting he had examined in 30 years of practice. She did not know about Mr. Brent yet. She did not know a great many things. What she knew was the work. The work was precise and quiet and honest. And it was, she had come to understand, the thing that had kept her sane during the 3 years in which the bath season had been deciding what to make of her. She had heard the label. She had heard it first from a woman at a card party in her second bath season, a Mrs. Beauclair who had meant to be speaking only to the woman beside her and had misjudged the acoustics. The poor barren creature, Mrs. Beauclair had said, could not hold him, you understand. It is very sad, but what can one expect? She had heard it since in various forms. The childless wife, the abandoned woman, the one who could not give him what he needed. The season had absorbed the explanation Edmund had offered and had found it satisfactory because it was the sort of explanation the season was designed to process, and because the alternative that lived in her ledger, was more complicated and considerably more damaging to people of standing. She had heard the label. She had written her columns. The 2 activities had occupied her 3 years, and they continued to occupy her in the spring of this particular bath season, and she had not yet determined what she would do when the work was finished. But she had determined that the work would be finished, and finished correctly, before she made any other decision. If Lord Aldermere had opinions about her morning routine, he expressed them by appearing in the pump room on the same mornings she attended, with his newspaper and his unread quality of reading it, and by occasionally making observations that were not precisely conversation, but occupied the same general space. She found, to her moderate surprise, that she did not object to this. She had grown accustomed, in her 3 bath seasons, to the particular flavor of male attention that read her situation as an opportunity, and she had become fluent in the deflections it required. Lord Aldermere's attention had no such flavor. It had instead the quality of a man who was watching something that interested him and was in no particular hurry to do anything about the interest. He was in Bath to settle estate business, she gathered. Something connected to a property near Bristol that his late father had left tangled. He had said, at one point, that estates left tangled were a more common inheritance than clean ones, and he had said it with the dry economy of a man who had thought about it rather than the theatrical resignation of a man performing long-suffering, and she had found the distinction notable. She also found the silver case notable. She noticed it on the 4th morning they occupied adjacent chairs, when his coat fell open as he reached for his cup, and she saw the small, bright rectangle in his breast pocket. The way it caught the light, the way his hand moved briefly toward it in the same unconscious gesture with which she sometimes touched the corner of her account ledger through the fabric of her reticule. She did not ask about it. A man's breast pocket was not a subject she had license to inquire into. But she noticed. He asked her, on the 5th morning, whether she had attended the Thursday evening gathering at the rooms of Lady Pemsworth, who was a minor figure in Bath society, but held respectable musical parties. She had attended. She said so. "I thought I saw you," he said. "You were speaking with a young woman in a blue dress." The young woman in the blue dress had been a Mrs. Cartwright, 24, recently widowed, who had been approached during the evening by the widower Mr. Desmond Ferris with a proposal that was, on its surface, an offer of a lease on a small property in Wiltshire, and was, in every other respect, an attempt to acquire a young woman's comfort and companionship in exchange for a roof she was perfectly capable of procuring for herself if she understood the terms of her late husband's settlement. Mrs. Cartwright had not, at that point, understood the terms. Cecily had spent 20 minutes explaining them to her, quietly and precisely, in the particular way that her father had taught her, the way that made numbers comprehensible to people who had been raised to find them frightening. Mr. Ferris had come to retrieve Mrs. Cartwright twice during those 20 minutes, and Cecily had both times smoothly incorporated him into the explanation, which he had found less comfortable than he had expected, and which had resulted, ultimately, in Mrs. Cartwright announcing that she thought she would consult her own solicitor before making any decisions about Wiltshire. "I was explaining a settlement to a friend," Cecily said. "So I gathered," said Lord Aldermere, in the tone that had no elaboration, but did not need it. "She seemed considerably more settled when you were finished." It was not a compliment, precisely. It was an accurate observation. She found that she preferred accurate observations to compliments in roughly the same ratio that she preferred ledger work to correspondence, and that this preference, which she had thought of as a peculiarity, appeared to be shared by the man currently turning the newspaper page she had seen him read 3 times already. "You were there," she said. "Briefly," he said. "I arrived late. I was standing in the doorway when the conversation was already in progress." She had not seen him. She reviewed the geography of the evening and confirmed that she had not looked at the doorway, which meant that whatever he had seen without her knowledge of being watched. She considered this. She did not find it unsettling in the way that a watched sensation usually was. She found it, instead, strangely clarifying, the way that confirmation of a suspected fact will clarify rather than surprise. "It seemed to me," he said, "that you knew precisely what you were doing." "I did," she said. He looked at her with the gray eyes that received information without advertising what they made of it. He said nothing further. The pump room hummed around them. She turned back to her notebook and wrote a number in the upper left column that had been eluding her for 2 days, and it was correct. She could see that it was correct, and she sat for a moment with the precision of it before continuing. She told him about the silver case, in the end, because he told her first. Told her. They were walking on the gravel walk, which had been Cecily's suggestion on a morning when the pump room felt too close, and Lord Aldermere had fallen into step beside her in the way he had, as though proximity had been established by agreement, reached in some conversation she had missed. It was a cool morning in late March, the kind that smells of turned earth and something almost like the possibility of warmth, and they walked at the measured pace of 2 people who were not walking for the pleasure of arriving anywhere. She had not asked. He had put his hand briefly to his breast pocket, the unconscious gesture, and then caught himself. And then, in the quiet that followed the catching, said, "My wife died in childbed 4 years ago. The child is well." She stopped walking. He stopped walking because she had. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it in the specific way that people who have received the irreversible mean it, without the decorative additions. "I was not present," he said. "I was in Bristol, settling a matter I had believed could wait." He said this without drama, in the same level way he said most things, which made it considerably more weighted than if he had performed it. The matter could have waited. She stood on the gravel walk in her gray-green pelisse and looked at the trees, which had not yet committed to being green again, and understood something about the quality of his silences, the particular quality she had been unable to name since the first evening at the upper rooms. It was the silence of someone who has had the thing they were most careful about, the thing they thought most about protecting, taken from them while they were looking the other way. "The case," she said. "In your pocket." He took it out. It was small and silver, worn at the corners, a miniature case of the kind that holds a portrait. He held it for a moment without opening it, and then he put it back. "Margaret," he said. Her name was Margaret. "I am sorry," she said again. And then, because it was true, and because she had a habit of saying true things when the moment was quiet enough, people will have told you that time is the remedy. In my experience, time is not the remedy. It is merely the medium through which one continues to live with the thing. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That is precisely it." They stood on the gravel walk in the cool late March air, and she did not tell him yet about the ledger or about the £14,317, because this moment did not call for it. There was a time for accounts and a time for the acknowledgement of grief, and she was, among other things, good at distinguishing between the two. If you are still with Cecily on that walk, you already know the season was not finished with her. She told him about the ledger the following week in the small sitting room of her Pulteney Street lodgings, to which Agnes admitted him at 4 p.m, with the expression of a woman who has made a judgment and is entirely comfortable standing by it. Lord Aldermere sat across from Cecily at the round table and read what she showed him, in the same quiet, methodical way he did most things, and did not perform surprise or outrage, or any of the responses she had learned to expect from men who encountered a woman presenting documentary evidence. He turned pages. He moved from one volume to the next. He asked, at intervals, questions that were precise and unadorned, and that she could answer precisely. When he had finished, he sat back and looked at the 6 volumes arranged on the table between them. 14,000, he said. 14,317 pounds, she said, over 4 years, drawn from accounts that were maintained in my name and in the name of the household, altered to attribute the expenditure to domestic expenses and to what is recorded in the altered version as my jointure allowance, though my jointure allowance was £1,200 a year, and could not in 4 years of intact expenditure have produced this figure. He looked at her for a moment. "You built this yourself," he said. "With Agnes's preservation of the originals," she said. "Without the originals, I would have had the reconstructed copies I made from memory, which would have been suggestive but not provable. With the originals, it is provable. A solicitor would need to review it." "Yes," she said. "I had thought so." He was quiet for a moment, with the quality of stillness she had come to read as calculation rather than absence. Then he said, "I know a man in London. He is thorough, and he is accustomed to working with documentary evidence of this complexity." "I am not asking you to involve yourself," she said. "I showed you because I thought you would understand what it was." "I understand what it is," he said. "I am offering because I choose to." He said it simply, without the grammar of a man doing a woman a favor, without the register of charity or protection. The way he said most things, level and complete, meaning exactly what the words said. "May I write to him?" She looked at the 6 volumes on her table. She looked at Lord Aldermere, who was watching her with the gray eyes that waited without pressure. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Agnes came in with a second pot of tea and set it down without comment, which was as close to approval as Agnes's face permitted. Lady Evelyn Vane called on Cecily on the 22nd of March, without advance notice, at 10 in the morning. When Agnes was at the market, and Cecily was alone with the ledger and the light from the back parlor window. The footman who admitted her was the footman of the lodgings, who had no instruction to exclude her, and Lady Evelyn moved through a room as though exclusion were not a concept she had required to navigate. She sat in the chair opposite Cecily with the deliberate composure of someone who had planned what to say. "You are making things difficult," she said, "for a great many people." Cecily set the ledger aside, not closing it, simply setting it aside, with the unhurried precision of someone who does not need to hide what she is doing. "I was not aware I was making anything," she said. "Edmund tells me you have declined to sign the deed." "That is accurate." Lady Evelyn looked at her with the same gray eyes Edmund had inherited, and which he wore with less composure. In his mother's face, the gray was steadier, and the steadiness was not warmth, but the product of long practice. "You are 30 years past the age at which any other arrangement will be possible for you," she said. "The deed gives you the remainder of your jointure, which is rather more than you have now. It gives Edmund the ability to make a life." "With Miss Hartley," Cecily said. "Miss Hartley is a sensible young woman who understands what a marriage of this kind requires." "Unlike myself," Cecily said, with the measured absence of heat that she had developed over 3 years and that she found considerably more effective than heat. Lady Evelyn's fan moved once, a small, precise stroke. "You were not suited to it," she said. "The poor barren creature has no claim on Edmund's sympathy now, and prolonging this serves no one." Cecily looked at Lady Evelyn across the small parlor table. "I am not prolonging anything," she said. "I am correcting the record." Lady Evelyn left shortly thereafter, with the bearing of a woman who had delivered a message and expected it to be received in the spirit intended. She did not look at the ledger as she passed the table. Cecily waited until the door was shut, and then she sat in the quiet of the back parlor for a long time, with the ledger open in front of her, and the light from the window falling across the columns. Edmund came himself on the 25th. He came at 11, which was the hour at which she had always been accessible to the household, which told her he remembered her habits and was deploying the memory tactically. He sat in the chair his mother had sat in, and he looked at her with the expression she had spent 4 married years learning to read, the expression of a man who was about to be reasonable. He had aged. Not badly, but precisely, the way men age who eat well and sleep adequately and carry their discomforts in their faces rather than their bodies. He was 41 now, and he wore it with the easy authority of someone who had never been required to doubt whether age would be kind to him. "Cecily," he said, using her given name in the way he always had, as though intimacy were a position one could occupy by habit rather than by choice. "This has gone on long enough. The separation has been in force for 3 years, she said. "I agree it has." He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. "The deed is generous," he said. "I hope you will look at it more carefully." "I have looked at it carefully," she said. "I have looked at a great many documents carefully. It has become something of a habit." His eyes dropped briefly to the ledger. He looked at it the way a person looks at a thing they do not wish to be seen looking at. "Those old books," he said, "are not what you believe them to be." "I believe them to be household accounts," she said, "kept in my hand for 4 years of a marriage, and compared against the record submitted to your solicitors, which does not match them." She said this in the same tone she would have used to describe the weather. "They are precisely what I believe them to be." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him with the patience she had developed over 3 years of very quiet evenings, and then something moved in his face, something she recognized, the recalculation of a man who has bet on a reading of a situation and is beginning to suspect the reading was wrong. "My wife was barren," he said, and the pronoun was deliberate, a correction and a categorization at once. "The accounts she waves about are a barren woman's last vanity." He said it the way one says a thing that has been tested and found serviceable, not with conviction, but with the confidence of someone who has seen it work before. She let it sit in the room for a moment, the way one lets something settle so that it can be observed clearly. A solicitor is reviewing those accounts this week, she said. I expect his findings to be available before the Friday assembly. Edmund looked at her. She looked at him. He left at 11:30, and she listened to the sound of his steps on the stair. And when the outer door had closed, she sat in the quiet for a moment, and then opened the ledger to the page she had been on, and continued working. The Friday assembly at the upper rooms was attended by 230 people, which was a respectable number for late March, when the season was thinning toward its close. Cecily arrived at 8, accompanied by Agnes, who had put on her second-best dress, and was wearing it with the air of a woman who has come to a specific occasion for a specific purpose. Mr. Alistair Brent arrived separately. He was a compact, precise man of 55 who had come down from London at Lord Aldermere's request, and who had spent the preceding 4 days at Cecily's parlor table with the 6 account volumes and a system of notation she had provided him, and had said very little during those 4 days, except to ask questions that were, without exception, the correct questions. He had delivered his written findings that morning in a sealed document that she had not opened because she had not needed to open it. She knew what was in it. She had built what was in it. Lord Aldermere was already present when she arrived. She saw him across the room in the same place he had occupied that first evening, near the far side, with the quality of someone who had decided to be somewhere. He saw her come in. He crossed the room in 3 measured strides and offered her his arm, and she took it, which was not the sort of thing that went unobserved in the upper rooms of Bath, and the room observed it. Lady Evelyn, seated near the orchestra, went very still. Edmund, near the central pillar with Miss Hartley, turned and saw them, and went the specific color of a man who has miscalculated the geometry of an evening. They did not move toward Edmund. They stood together near the edge of the floor, and Lord Aldermere said something low about the orchestra's choice of program, and she said something in return, and it was, from the outside, a very ordinary exchange between 2 people who were comfortable in each other's company. And from the inside, it was the precise, quiet action of 2 people who had each decided, separately and then together, that a thing had gone on long enough. Edmund crossed the room at 8:30. He crossed it with the composure of a man who had miscalculated but was not yet prepared to acknowledge it, and he came to stand before Cecily and Lord Aldermere with the expression of someone about to perform a scene he had rehearsed. "Aldermere," he said, using the name in the flat, possessive way of a man claiming prior claim on a field. "I wonder if I might have a word with my wife." "Your estranged wife," Lord Aldermere said. "Miss Vane, as she prefers." A silence fell around them, the particular expanding silence of 200 people who have just realized that what they are watching is not an ordinary social exchange. "She has been spreading a great many unfounded claims about my household finances," Edmund said, loud enough for the silence to carry it. He was performing for the room now. She recognized that. He was making it a public statement, so that the room's collective authority would do his work for him. "The accounts of a woman who has every reason for bitterness are not a reliable source of anything. My wife was barren, and she has determined that the proper response to a natural deficiency is to manufacture a financial one." The room was very quiet. Then Mr. Alistair Brent, who had been standing at the edge of the orchestra platform with his document case, crossed to their position with the unhurried pace of a man for whom unhurried was the only pace, and placed a document on the small side table that stood beside the orchestra stairs, and said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "I am Mr. Alistair Brent, solicitor of London. I have spent 4 days reviewing the household accounts of the Vane marriage as maintained in original by the estranged wife, compared against the amended record submitted to the Vane family solicitors. I am prepared to describe my findings." The room remained very quiet. Edmund said, These are private family matters and have no place in an assembly room. They are financial records, Mr. Brent said, relating to funds that belong to Miss Vane by the terms of her original settlement, and their accuracy is a matter of legal consequence. He said this without inflection, the way one states the temperature. The accounts were kept by a woman who could not provide an heir, Edmund said, and his voice had acquired the thin quality of a man who can hear the ground beneath him shifting and is speaking louder to compensate. They are the work of a barren wife with nothing else to do with her time. The silence was absolute. Lord Aldermere took one step forward. He did not raise his voice. He said, in the level, specific way he said things that were intended to be final. Miss Vane's accounts are the only honest record in this room. Edmund's face underwent a series of small adjustments. Lady Evelyn's fan stopped moving. Miss Hartley, who had been standing 2 feet from Edmund, took one quiet step sideways and remained there, not departing, but separating herself in the particular way of someone who has made a rapid reassessment. Mr. Brent spoke for 4 minutes. He described the discrepancy. He described its nature, its magnitude, and its distribution across 4 years of altered entries. He described the original documents and their provenance. He described what the altered record had attributed to domestic expenditure and household maintenance, and what the original record revealed those attributions to have concealed. He used the figure, £14,317. He said it once, clearly, in the middle of his account, and let the room do with it what rooms do with large numbers presented without editorial. He said that the funds had been drawn from accounts maintained in Miss Vane's name and had been redirected to obligations that were his own, gaming obligations principally, and several others of a less easily categorized nature that Mr. Brent declined to specify in public, but indicated were documented in his written findings. When he finished, the room did not applaud. It simply existed in the particular way of 200 people who have been told a thing they had already half believed and are now integrating the confirmation. Edmund said, "This is absurd." No one agreed with him. Lady Evelyn rose from her chair. She was upright and composed, and she walked to her son and stood beside him, with the expression of a woman who has built a structure and is watching it exhibit unexpected architectural problems. She said quietly, something that Cecily could not hear, and Edmund responded to it. And then Lady Evelyn looked across the room at Cecily, with the gray eyes that had inventoried her that first evening. And this time, what was in them was not satisfaction. It was something considerably more complicated and more human, and Cecily looked back at her without triumph, because she did not feel triumphant. She felt mostly tired. She felt underneath the tired something that was beginning, very slowly, to be the other side of exhaustion. Lord Aldermere did not speak again until they were out of the assembly room, standing in the corridor, where the sound of the resumed orchestra reached them, muffled and slightly absurd. Agnes was beside them, with the expression of a woman who has been patient for 3 years and is now exercising the specific restraint of not saying she told anyone so, because she is too dignified to require that satisfaction. He said, "Are you well?" It was not a question with the expectation of a particular answer. It was the kind of question that asks simply whether one is present, still here, still standing in one's own body. "Yes," she said. And then, because she found precision comforting. "Or I will be," she said. "Presently." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Come to dinner. Agnes, too, if she's willing. I know a house in Camden Place that sets a very quiet table." Agnes, who had not been asked, said, "I'll fetch her police." The dinner at Camden Place was quiet, as promised. 3 people, a fire, a table set simply. Lord Aldermere spoke about the Bristol estate's surveying discrepancy, which had been producing complications for 11 years and was now resolved. Cecily spoke about her father's parish in Dorset, the stone church, and the particular quality of Dorset light in winter. Agnes ate steadily and said almost nothing, and radiated the settled contentment of a woman who has been waiting for a particular evening for 3 years and is finding it worth the wait. She walked back to Pulteney Street later, with Agnes at her side, and the night air of Bath cold and clear. The legal proceedings would take time and require patience, and the careful holding of an argument through whatever turbulence the opposing solicitors might create. She had been precise and careful for 3 years. She was adequately prepared to continue. The following Tuesday she went back to the pump room, and she sat in her chair, and she opened her calfskin notebook and she began a new column. She was calculating the order in which the counterclaims would need to be addressed, the hierarchy of legal precedents, and the sequence of argument, when a newspaper settled onto the table beside her, and a shadow fell across the page. She did not look up immediately. She had learned, in the preceding weeks, that he was not a man who required her to perform her awareness of his presence. "I have a question," Lord Aldermere said. "Ask it," she said. He sat in the chair beside her. He was quiet for a moment, with the quality of a man organizing words that he wishes to say correctly. "When this is concluded," he said, "I mean to ask you something. I am telling you now, so that you know. So that you have time to think. And I do not appear in your sitting room one afternoon with a question you have not been given the opportunity to consider." She looked up from the notebook. He was watching her with the gray eyes, and in them, for the first time, she saw what had been there from the beginning, but had been rendered in too fine a hand for the assembly room's light. Not calculation, not assessment, not the processing of a situation. Something considerably simpler, and considerably harder to mistake, and considerably harder to look at and away from in the same motion. "I see," she said. "You do not need to say anything now," he said. "I meant only that you should know." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the pump room and the gravel walk, and the dinner at Camden Place, and the sound of his voice in the assembly room, level and final. She thought about the silver case, and the name he had said on the gravel walk, the name he did not say in public, the name he carried. She thought about what it was to be careful for a very long time, and what it was to find, at the end of that time, that the carefulness had built something, rather than merely preserved it. "I know," she said. "I have known for some time." He said nothing. The pump room hummed. She turned back to her notebook and wrote the first entry in the new column, and he opened his newspaper to the page he had already read, and read it again, and they sat together in the warm, bright room while Bath went about its morning business around them, and the season turned, and somewhere outside the windows the trees on the gravel walk committed at last to being green. That spring, while the legal proceedings wound through their proper channels, while Mr. Brent produced his formal documentation, and Edmund's solicitors produced their responses, and the thing moved at the measured pace of things that have been built correctly and cannot be easily dismantled. Lord Aldermere walked with Cecily on the gravel walk most mornings, and attended the pump room on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and occasionally appeared at the door of her Pulteney Street lodgings with the air of a man who had been in the neighborhood on other business, and had decided, having arrived in the neighborhood, that he had time for tea. Agnes always made the tea strong, and never said anything about the frequency of the visits, which was, Cecily had come to understand, Agnes's manner of expressing settled approval. On an evening in late April, when Bath was beginning to empty and the season was settling into its particular mild conclusion, Lord Aldermere came to Pulteney Street at 7 and stayed through the hour of candles, and they sat across the round parlor table, and he said the thing he had told her in the pump room he intended to say. He said it without preamble, In the direct, unhurried way, he said things that were meant to be final, and she listened to all of it. And when he finished, she said yes. In the same specific way, she said things that were meant to be final. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the silver case and set it on the mantelpiece, in the open. It was the first time she understood that he had set it somewhere he could see it, rather than somewhere he kept it from sight. He stood looking at it for a moment, and she stood beside him, and the candlelight moved across the silver. Then he took her account ledger from the table where she had left it, and he held it for a moment in both hands, and he crossed the room and returned it to her. She took it from him. It was warm from his hands. Outside the window of the Pulteney Street lodgings, snow had begun to fall. Light, improbable April snow, the kind that does not settle but hangs in the air for a few minutes, as though considering its options. It fell past the window in the candlelight, brief and quiet and unhurried. And Cecily stood in her parlor with her ledger in her hands and the silver case on the mantelpiece, and the man who had said her name in an assembly room the way that names are said when they are meant. And she thought that she had been very patient for a very long time, and that the accounts, at last, were correct. The silver case stayed on the mantelpiece. If her journey through these rooms and walks and columns has moved you, leave a thought in the comments, and thank you for staying to the last page.